Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A very good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us, to all of you. My name is Jawad Zarif, and we are going to discuss, hopefully, for the next few talks, the question of transition in the world. Let me begin by just making a few observations. The past 30 years have been some of the most turbulent periods, at least in contemporary history. We have seen wars, we have seen emergence of drastic new changes, and we have seen disasters in the international community. The end of what we all knew as the Cold War disturbed a familiar pattern for all of us, both practitioners as well as thinkers and analysts. We were used to a rather comfortable pattern of thinking and action during the Cold War. Relations were rather rigid in the international community. We all knew what to expect, more or less, and we all knew how to predict the future with some degree of certainty. After the end of the Cold War, some people thought that they had won the Cold War, and therefore there was a fury of activity, not only on the ground, but within think tanks, universities, and academia in general, in order to develop a new future, either in terms of action and the realities on the ground, or in terms of conceptualization and somehow not just predicting, but prescribing theoretically what should happen. And because of the rapidity of change and the fluidity of international arena, we had many miscalculations and many misadventures. And nobody was immune from this. Big powers made miscalculations. Medium powers made miscalculations with varying degrees of effects. And there were a number of predictions, or in my view, prescriptions, by both theorists as well as practitioners, which proved to be disastrously wrong, or at least premature. Now, we all remember the announcement of a new world order in the early 90s by the US president. We all remember some academics writing about end of sovereignty in the mid to late 80s, talking about the end of state as a player in international relations. We saw the emergence of the concept of global governance. We had some euphoria about triumph of multilateralism. We had some predictions and prescriptions about the new American century. we had an announcement on the deck of a warship, mission accomplished. We then had back to extremist unilateralism and the return of nation state. These are all conceptual contexts that we have developed over the past 30-some years to describe, predict, and as I said, at times prescribe the emerging new world. And now, many talk about post-corona global order. We see a lot of discussion whether this would be an exacerbation of the current trends or the emergence of a totally different new trend. All of these indicate the significance of this time frame within which we are talking, we are operating, and we are conceptualizing. And that is why we need a cognitive transformation. If we want to be able to understand what's happening, if we want to avoid miscalculations, if we want to avoid misadventures, we need to realize, we need to understand what is happening. In reality, what we need to do is we need a realistic understanding, and more importantly, an honest articulation of where we are, where we want to be, and where we are actually going to be. Because sometimes we don't necessarily realize what we aim for, and sometimes we get more than what we bargained for. Just remember President Trump saying we spent $7 trillion in order to shape a new world order, and we failed. Now, in the next 5 sessions, we will be discussing, God willing, about a number of things. In this session, after this brief introduction, we will talk about the importance of transition, a brief historical background, the consequences and domains of globalization, and the role of theory and competing theoretical perspective. We may not be able to address all of them, but we will try. In our second session, we will deal with the characteristics of the transitional period, both in terms of conceptual transformations, the new concepts, and the new definitions of old concepts such as power, and theoretical challenges that we face. In the third session, we will deal with power shifts, both in terms of new sources and centers of power, new players, and the roles and challenges faced by old players. Hopefully, in the fourth session, we talk about the end of hegemony, global hegemony, as well as regional hegemony. We talk about the struggle of global powers, struggle of great powers, the emergence of new powers, what the Munich Security Conference described in 2017 as the post-Western world, and described in 2020 as a state of restlessness. These are important developments that we will discuss in the fourth session. And lastly, we will discuss about Iran and the changing world. Now, let me first talk about a historical perspective as we already discussed the importance of this global transition. Throughout history, we've had phases where the old order collapsed and the new order emerged. These phases usually were coupled with wars and a great deal of bloodshed. There can be different benchmarks for this transitional phases. Unfortunately, since international relations has been mostly a Western institution, and even probably more than a Western institution, an American institution, most of these periods are periods in Western history. So we're all familiar with these various phases or various historical benchmarks where we had the emergence of a transitional phase and the end of an old phase and the beginning of a new phase in Western societies. For the time being, we have to live with that. I believe these purely Western approaches fail to give us full recognition and full understanding of what is happening in the rest of the world, and that is why we need non-Western conceptualizations of this new emerging global order, because the new emerging global order will not be purely Western. We have 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, the emergence of nation-state as a unit of international relations, and the concept of sovereignty, and the absolute authority of the sovereign to rule within their territory. Then the next breaking point is the 1814-1815 Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, and the emergence of a new global order we all recognize as the balance of power system. The failure of that system leading to the First World War, the end of the First World War, 1919, idealistic perceptions and predictions of the future world, attempts to end war, delegitimize the use of force, the 1928 Brian-Clough Pact of Paris, and other similar activities, the establishment of the League of Nations, and that's where we start the formation of the discipline of international relations, mostly, as I said, an American discipline. And most of these theories that have developed since then are Western-centered theories. Obviously, after a world war, the focus of both idealists as well as realists at that time was how to prevent war and how to maintain peace and security. There were different alternatives, different suggestions at that time, so theoretical conceptualization of the future world was based on both intellectual interest as well as national political interest. Then we have the Second World War, the failure of the system of the League, and the disasters that came about with the Second World War, and then the emergence of the United Nations, a more realistic, not in terms of realism versus idealism, but a more true to the realities of the day system of global institutions. Both the United Nations, Bretton Woods, others, a package that represented an understanding of what went wrong in the past. But that package also proved to be not working exactly in the direction that the forefathers of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions predicted. We had the Cold War. Within the United Nations, basically, Cold War started both outside the UN in the outside world, as well as within the halls of the United Nations. And it ruled the United Nations for some 4 decades. The activities of the United Nations were ruled by the Cold War, and the international power struggle was ruled by Cold War. It was rather rigid. Of course, there were attempts to play outside the Cold War. The non-aligned movement, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, these were all attempts to bypass the Cold War rivalries, either based on non-alignment or based on the neither East nor West policy, or similar approaches that had taken place. But more or less, it was clear that there were frameworks, context for both action and theory. Those who tried to work outside that context faced serious challenge. A very serious example is the Iran-Iraq War, where at the height of the Cold War, everybody came to the assistance of one side, in spite of Cold War allegiances, in spite of where that particular country was placed in the Cold War rivalry, because a player was playing outside this framework of the global system. That's how rigid it was. At the height of the Cold War, everybody came to the aid of one side. The United Nations Security Council failed to address a clear case of aggression, even blamed to some extent Iran for the problems. And at the end, when Iran was making gains in the battle fronts, all 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, came together and established this institution we know now as P5. Because in the past there were 5 permanent members, but there was not an institution of P5. After the Secretary General made a statement in the Islamic conference in Kuwait, he invited the 5 permanent members, and they started working on how to end the Iran-Iraq war without Iran being the winner. Why? Because Iran was working outside that framework. But that framework, which all of us used to recognize, not recognize as lawful, but recognized as reality on the ground, broke down. Probably because of Afghanistan, probably because the Soviet Union overexerted itself, probably because of the flaws within the Soviet system, within the Eastern Bloc. For whatever reason, it broke down. And that ended an era which has had a great influence on our mentality, on our way of thinking, and on our way of action. When I say our, I mean the global community, the international community. Maybe the Iranians were an exception, but the international community used to think within certain frameworks. We like to call it Cold War mentality. Although the system broke down, the mentality didn't. Because usually conceptual frameworks are more lasting than realities on the ground. we started in 1990 the beginning of what a lot of people expected to be a long transitional phase. People believed that there would be a long transitional phase. There was at least consensus that the new order will take some time to emerge. But some people believe that this new order will be prefaced by an era of unipolarity. That is, the United States being the superior power. Well, there were reasons that helped create that misperception. First was the Iraq War. After all permanent members of the Security Council came together to end the Iran-Iraq War during the Cold War era, after the invasion of Kuwait, basically everybody joined the coalition that the United States had built in order to expel Iraq from Kuwait. Countries including Syria, for instance, were members of the coalition. Of course, Russia did not join actually, but it did not do anything to block. And that is why the misperception in the United States that a new world order had emerged was to the extent that President Bush Sr. In the General Assembly announced the emergence of a new world order. That was an important flaw, and as I will describe later, it had immense cost, both on the international community as well as on the United States itself. And then we had the emergence of globalization. Of course, globalization in terms of trade had started a long time. Probably, some believe, in the beginning of the 20th century. But globalization had reached new levels. Globalization had reached a new cognitive status. That is, we all understood, some sooner than others, that not only trade was globalized, but many other things were globalized. Maybe even security was globalized. When these all happened, there were a number of attempts to create a new world order, or to expedite a new world order, or to institutionalize certain advantages in order to make them long-lasting. At the conceptual level, let me give you three of the most famous conceptual frameworks. From the liberal tradition, we had the idea of the end of history. That was a conceptual framework for a new American world order. From the more realist frame of mind, we had Clash of Civilizations, the prediction of the state of the future and how it had to be dealt with. And then from a very practical point of view, we had the Neoconservative Movement. The Neoconservative Movement was based on one major assumption. And it had a very direct impact on practice. So this theory was not just to explain what would happen in the future, and not to predict, but to prescribe. It believed, and it believes, that the primacy of the United States after the end of Cold War was not going to be permanent. That the emergence of China and other global players was an eventuality that could not be escaped. Therefore, its prescription was to institutionalize US predominance through bringing everything to the realm of security. And that is why securitization has been a cornerstone of US policy to create the next world that the United States wants to create in its own advantage. From that, at least overemphasized since then, the United States has an advantage in the area of military power. So if you can securitize issues, the United States would then be the leader. Both the leader of the West, because there were Western contentions. As I will explain, there were different European perspectives on how to make the next global world through norm setting. And in that area, the United States was not necessarily predominant. But in the area of security, the United States would have been totally predominant. So if you look at the administrations that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, you will see each and every administration resorted to force. The Bush administration, but not just the Bush administration, the Clinton administration. If you look at the history of the Clinton administration, at least one military adventure a year. Whether it was Somalia, whether it was Libya, Kosovo, Yugoslavia, you name it, or Iraq. The Clinton administration resorted to force because it wanted to institutionalize and basically provide longevity for its what it considered to be, accepted to be, short-term supremacy. They wanted to give this short-term supremacy a long term. That is why even today, after failing in this policy rather disastrously several times, the United States continues to try to securitize its adversaries, be it Iran or the Chinese. You've seen that the United States is trying to securitize even the coronavirus. The US administration, President Trump and his Secretary of State, trying to call coronavirus the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus. They have refrained from joining certain global consensus decisions on corona because they insisted that it should be called the China virus. Going back to probably Middle Ages, calling China man. This is the trend that some of us believe is a bit childish, but in reality, it follows the same conceptualization of the basically entrenchment of US power. And it's clear, if we are engaged, if the world accepts to engage in a game of military might, then the United States alone spends more money on military hardware than the next 10 countries combined. And the United States spends $600 billion on arms, whereas the next country, which is China, with almost 5 times the population of the United States, spends less than $300 billion. And the next 2 countries, Russia and Saudi Arabia or vice versa, each spend in the framework of $60, $70 billion. And then it drops drastically to 20s. So the next 10 countries combined don't spend as much money on armaments as the United States alone does. And that is why the United States wants to securitize everything. And it started in the 90s. It may have started even earlier, but in this period that we're talking about, the United States wanted to bring about a securitized global environment in which it would be the predominant force and it would be able to govern. Now we'll talk about the flaws of this approach and the immense cost that this approach had. But this was not the only approach. The Europeans followed a different approach, and that was norm setting. They tried to use the post-Soviet era, where they had little basically resistance in the international community. The non-aligned, some of the non-aligned members even were talking about whether non-aligned made any sense anymore. Because they said non-aligned was supposed to stand between the two superpowers. Now we don't have two superpowers. Now we don't have a Cold War. So what is the non-alignment? And there was a great deal of struggle by countries like Iran to say within the non-aligned movement that non-alignment still made sense, because there were these attempts to create the next world. And we as countries in the developing world, with a specific frame of reference, insisting on international law, insisting on international organizations, needed to have a say in the development of the new world. But the West basically found itself without a real opposition. So the United States pursued the military path. The Europeans, mostly, sometimes with US support, but sometimes even against US opposition, pursued norm setting. Now with US support, there were a number of concepts that everybody in the West agreed upon, because these were primarily Western concepts developed into universal concepts. Human rights, environment and development. If you look from 1990 to beginning of the new century, you will see more conferences convened by the United Nations, more global conferences, more world conferences convened by the United Nations, and probably in the previous 3 decades. Because this ideological rivalry had ended, and the West found it appropriate to start norm setting. Now we have the World Conference on Environment and Development, followed by the Conference on Social Development, followed by the World Conference on Human Rights, followed by the World Conference on Women, Habitat, Population and Development, you name it. Every issue of social relations, or what they call good governance, was covered during the early 90s to late 90s through these international conferences. A number of common themes in these conferences emerged. Of course, the developing world tried to introduce some of their concerns, such as economic equity, such as development, but the main concepts, from habitat to women to social development, were a number of concepts which were promoted by the West. I'm not necessarily saying that they were Western concepts, but promoted by the West, which are in the realm of human rights and social relations. In this area, they went beyond consensus in the West. The most notable area of challenge within the West during this area was the issue of criminal responsibility. Europeans aligned themselves with Africans and Latin Americans to create the International Criminal Court against the opposition of the United States. So this was an area, and this was an alarm bell for the United States, that unless it focused on its area of superiority, that is military and security, then even its Western allies might break away with it, as they did in the International Criminal Court. Some people believe that the International Criminal Court was not important for the United States. I believe it was otherwise, because it was so important for the United States that the United States went to nearly 160, 70 countries, signing with them separate agreements to prevent sending of U.S. forces to the International Criminal Court. Now, recently, the United States has threatened to designate members of the International Criminal Court if they bring certain U.S. forces to justice. So that is how important this issue was to the United States. But nevertheless, it was approved. And it went to force. I mean, it is now an institution that is in force with the objection of the United States. So norm setting was an area in which the international community played an active role during this period in the shaping of the new world. It wasn't limited to social areas. In the security realm, there were also serious norm settings. We had the Chemical Weapons Convention. The first protocol on the prohibition of the use of chemical weapons was in 1925. From 1925 to 1995, there were uses of chemical weapons, but there were no agreement on a multilateral treaty or a multilateral convention. But we had the Chemical Weapons Convention, one of the most far-reaching disarmament instruments. Then we had the indefinite extension of the NPT. When NPT was signed, it wasn't supposed to be indefinite, because countries who signed the NPT did not agree to the division of the world into nuclear haves and nuclear have-nots. They believed that this has to come to an end at a certain stage, and the nuclear powers had to abandon their nuclear weapons. That is why they gave it a 25-year lifetime. But in 1995, in the Review and Extension Conference, the West was able to break a consensus by the non-aligned, 118 members, a consensus by the non-aligned that only an extension based on a date for disarmament could be accepted. From 118 non-aligned members, because of this overwhelming situation of end of the Cold War and the emergence of what some believed was a new world order, 90 of the non-aligned countries joined the other side in calling for the indefinite extension of the NPT. And only 18, including Iran, were left to call for a time frame for denuclearization. These are important norm-setting developments that happened in that period. And finally, we see the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, where the developing world is coming back with using the United Nations in order to set its own agenda. Of course, with certain ingredients from the overwhelming atmosphere that was established at that time. Oh, I'll come to the end of this session. Let me just talk about miscalculations, and we will end here. Because of the fluidity of the international relations, and I will discuss this in our next session, there can be wrong calculations. Sometimes these calculations are tactically correct, but they do not take into account the strategic changes following the end of Cold War. They still base themselves in Cold War mentality. The miscalculations by medium powers led to the disintegration of Yugoslavia. Milosevic made a serious miscalculation about the interest of the United States following the end of the Cold War. And he believed that the United States would tolerate basically the takeover. And the US gave him reason for that. The US State Department made an announcement that Yugoslavia does not fall within the areas of vital national security interest for the United States. His miscalculation, which was a strategic miscalculation, not a tactical miscalculation, led him, strategic miscalculation in terms of not understanding the realities of the transition period, not only led him to become a prisoner, but led Yugoslavia to be disintegrated, and we saw one of the worst carnage in recent history in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have Saddam Hussein, who believed this was the time. He was an excellent tactician. He even timed his invasion of Kuwait on a day that European holidays would begin, August 1st, and on the day of Ashura, when people in this region are mourning the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. So he used a very calculated time. He was also misled by April Glaspie, the US ambassador, who told her that she believed that it was not something that the United States would intervene, and it was for Iraq and Kuwait to address. That led to his demise and led to a disaster in our region for the last 3 decades. A miscalculation on the other side was also made by Gaddafi of Libya. These people were too aggressive, too assertive. He was too defensive. He made also a miscalculation. And that led to the disintegration of Libya and his own demise. So miscalculations do not necessarily need to be on the adventurous side. Miscalculations can also be on being basically submissive. That can be a miscalculation with disastrous consequences. The miscalculation by the United States, because they believed in the emergence of a new world order, because they believed that they should use their military power in order to perpetuate this into the next global order, they committed a major mistake of intervening. Military intervention became the norm in American global politics. And it's still the norm. In spite of President Trump said we have spent $7 trillion and not advanced U.S. interests, and he, during his 4 years, has spent another $1 billion in the same quagmire. Now, this misadventure has cost the American people a lot of lives, and $8 trillion, $8,000 billion, $8 trillion in treasure, but it has led to extremism in our region. It has led to terrorism in our region. The war on terror was in fact a breeding ground for terror, and we have seen that 2 administrations after the war on terror have tried to change that dynamic, but still are caught up with the same problem. I believe these are the results of either not understanding the realities of the transition, or attempting to prejudge the outcome, or attempting to expedite a desired outcome, and that has led to this disaster. That takes us to what we will discuss next time, and that is what are the realities of this change and how we can recognize it and have a realistic understanding. Thank you very much.